Hey everyone, Mad Naturalist Mr. Langers here. Thank you for joining me again today. Now, last time we were talking about terrestrial biomes, and we talked a bit about what kind of characters go into them. We know that on land, that the big things that are in charge there are the temperature and precipitation, and those climate conditions will dictate what kind of adaptation species will have. Now, today what we're going to look at are aquatic biomes, which are a little different. Temperature and precipitation and things like that do play a role, but they don't play the same kind of role. There are other factors we have to keep in mind when we look at aquatic biomes. And some of those factors include things like light availability. That's actually probably one of the more significant ones. How much light's available, because light will dictate how much photosynthesis is going on, and photosynthesis will dictate how much dissolved oxygen is in the water. And that's, well, everything right there. Also the depth of the water, because depth will play around with temperature and light availability, as well as some current issues. Temperature, water temperature, as always. Tides, things of that nature. Also, it's not on this list, but dissolved nutrients that are important for plant growth, as well as dissolved oxygen, which is usually abbreviated DO, just so you know when you see that later on. But all these things play a role in aquatic biomes, and because of that, aquatic biomes are divided and separated in slightly different ways. So today's goal is to look at these aquatic biomes and see where we go from there. On to the major aquatic biomes. This is not a comprehensive list because there are a bunch of smaller biomes, but these are some of the main groups, the main divisions on freshwater and in saltwater that we can apply to other biomes if we need to. All right, let's get started. All right. First off, with freshwater, let's take a look at streams and rivers. Now, we call these lotic systems, and we can divide them into three separate zones. So again, streams and rivers, any ribbon of flowing water across Earth's surface, that's what we're talking about with a lotic system. So here are our three zones. The first one's easy, it's the source zone. It tends to be shallower, colder water, faster flowing stream, has the most dissolved oxygen, or DO. It also has low nutrient levels inside the water, so you don't have as much, you have a lower net primary productivity. And remember, primary productivity is basically a measurement of photosynthesis. More primary productivity, the more plants mean more biodiversity. So there's fewer nutrients in the stream, so you don't have as many photosynthesizing plants. However, there's a lot of dissolved oxygen just because there's so much overturn with water, like literally rapids and the water flowing, you get a lot of dissolved oxygen that way. Now, if we move further downstream, now we're in this transition zone. The water's starting to slow down a little bit. The stream bed itself is wider, warmer temperatures. You have more nutrients, so you have more primary productivity. However, you have a little bit lower dissolved oxygen as opposed to the source zone. Most of the dissolved oxygen now is coming from photosynthesis, and that's how most of the dissolved oxygen in a waterway of any kind gets there, from photosynthesis from algae and phytoplankton and things like that. Now we end it in the floodplain zone, which is at the end towards the mouth of the stream or river. This is the widest portion of the bed. Usually, you usually find the warmest temperatures here. It's also tends to be on the shallower side because all the sediment is starting to build up as it slows down. You have higher turbidity, which basically means the water is cloudier. You have the least amount of dissolved oxygen in this area, and you have the highest net primary productivity. And that's because the nutrients keep building up in the sediments that get deposited in the delta and in the floodplain. That's why from history class, most of the major ancient civilizations built up inside a floodplain is because the nutrients from the entire course of the waterway gets deposited in this one region. The system falls within a watershed, and a watershed is something we're going to talk about later on, but basically it's a large drainage basin. It's an area of land that drains all the runoff into a single watercourse, whether it be a stream or a river. Moving on to ponds and lakes. So we call these lentic systems, and they come in two flavors. We have the oligotrophic, which are deep, steep-sided lakes or ponds that have very little nutrients, low primary productivity. They're usually fed by snowmelt or ice melt, so you tend to find them in more higher elevations and further north. And then you have eutrophic, which are shallow kind of ponds and lakes that have high turbidity. Remember, that's a measurement of cloudiness. We tend to have a lot of nutrients here, so we have a much higher net primary productivity. Now, depending on what, it doesn't matter if it's a pond or lake, you can divide them into several different zones, just like you could for a stream or a river. So let's take a look at those. So here's my highly detailed cross-section of a lake. The first thing we're going to look at is the littoral zone. This is the area right around the edge, the shoreline basically. And this is where you'll find the most primary productivity. You'll find light penetrating all the way down to the bottom of the pond, and that's important. Remember, light is a big player when we talk about these aquatic biomes. You tend to find rooted plants like your reeds or lily pads or things like that, and that provides a lot more habitat for a bunch of different creatures, a lot of invertebrates, vertebrates, amphibians, fish, reptiles, you name it, it usually finds a home here. Now, if we still stay in this lit zone of the water, we can move a little further off. So now we're not close to the floor of the pond. Now we're floating in open water. We have the limnetic zone. Lots of light, not a lot of nutrients out here, so you tend to find the only plants out here will be free-floating algae. So you get dissolved oxygen, but because there's so little nutrients, this almost becomes like a desert, basically a wet desert. Now, if we go a little further down, now we enter something called the profundal zone. We have a lower light content. Light isn't penetrating this far down, which means we have low net primary productivity. Light doesn't penetrate very far in water. At a certain point, the water will reflect all the light and refract all the light, so there'll be nothing left, and it becomes completely dark. And now, depending on your lake or pond, you may have light going all the way to the bottom, all the way throughout. But larger lakes, like the Great Lakes of North America, at a certain point, there is no more light. And close to the bottom, we call this the benthic zone. There is no light. Lots of nutrients there from building up in the sediments, but low primary productivity because there's no sunlight. There's no photosynthesis. Mostly what lives down here are invertebrates and decomposers. You find worms, snails, crustaceans, things of that nature, breaking down whatever it is that drifts down to the bottom. Now, to be clear, benthic can also refer to any part of a water system where you're dealing with the things that are living in the sediments and the soils in the bottom of the water column. So the benthic zone can be all the way up near the rim of the pond, right near the edge of the shoreline. It depends on how you look at it, so keep that in mind. But for our purposes, benthic is the region, the deep water region, where no light reaches. You have very little primary productivity and lots of nutrients present. Continuing with freshwater, we're going to look at inland wetlands. Now, wetlands are some of the more sensitive regions and biomes that we have to deal with on Earth's surface, and they also tend to be bulldozed and filled in because they're nice, big, flat areas, and you have to spend a lot of money to knock down trees. Problem is, you take away a lot of habitat that way. All right? So when we're talking about an inland wetland, we're talking about marshes, swamps, prairie potholes, floodplains, bogs, anything like that. If you have one of those names in your mind, we're talking about a wetland. Basically, it's an area of land that is covered either all year long or part of the year submerged somewhat in water. Very high productivity, lots of nutrients available here from decomposition and possibly from inflow from streams or rivers. Very important habitat, especially for amphibians and migrating songbirds. All right, so these are very important habitats, and they're usually very closely protected, at least here in the United States. Wetlands, besides just being there, they don't always appear to be the greatest habitat. There's a lot of mud, it can smell sometimes from decomposition, but it's important to understand that wetlands provide very important ecological services for humans and for the natural world in general. So some of the services they provide, they filter toxic water. So you have all the microbes living in there. They will break down pollutants that come in, and so the water leaving the wetland will usually be much cleaner. You can absorb a lot of storm runoff, so they act like sponges. You sustain stream flow in dry times. Because it's like a sponge, it slowly gives off its water, so a stream won't dry up right away during a drought. It helps resupply groundwater supplies by the same mechanism, helps maintain biodiversity, which is a big one, recreation, bird watching, exploring, hikes, those all can happen in wetlands, and also supply natural products, like, they provide habitat for fish and other creatures that you could harvest and eat or sell or things of that nature. Also study as well. So wetlands are critically important, and they're very sensitive to disturbance, and it's important for us to maintain them as best we can. Moving on to marine systems. We're going to look at the open ocean, or kind of like the ocean profile. It's not as detailed as it can be, but there's some overlap with freshwater systems in these marine systems. So let's take a look. This shouldn't be a surprise to you, but most of the planet Earth is covered in salt water. Well, it's covered in water, but mostly salt water. And the ocean itself has many biomes, and we're not going to talk about all of them here. We're talking about some of the key players. But, like I said, we can divide the ocean from shoreline out into several different zones. And the first one, right near the shoreline where the breaking waves are between the high tide and low tide mark, you have the intertidal zone, where there's a lot of nutrients present, and you tend to have a lot of biodiversity. You also tend to have creatures who are specialized in dealing with kind of some harsh conditions, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. Moving a little further off, you have the coastal zone, where sometimes same thing as the littoral zone from freshwater systems. Sunlight penetrates all the way to the bottom. You'll have rooted photosynthesizing plants. You'll have more complex communities. Tends to be a little harsher in conditions, so lower biodiversity, waves, and things of that nature, but that's not always the case. Moving off the coast into open water, now that you have the euphotic zone. It's the same thing as the limnetic zone in a pond. Lots of sunlight, very little nutrients, so very low biodiversity. Most of the ocean, the open ocean that is devoid of life near the surface because there's just nothing there. There's no plants, there's very little nutrients, there's very little food, so most of the ocean is more or less a desert. Then you have moved down a little further deeper. It's a little darker now because remember, sunlight does not penetrate all the way down. We have the bathyal zone, same thing as the profundal zone in a pond. Low light, low net primary productivity. And then finally we have the abyssal zone. It's the same thing as the benthic zone. And benthic applies here as well for any creature that lives on the bottom of the ocean, in the mud, in the sand, whatever it may be. Same thing as benthic, no light, little productivity at all. You still find life down there, but in very specific places. It's not as common or as widespread. Now, as I said, light is a big thing. Now, anywhere the light touches, that's what we call the photic zone. And down here, then we get into this aphotic zone, where it's completely dark. So that's something to keep in mind. If there's light there, you're part of this photic zone, especially near the surface. Once you are devoid of light, the aphotic zone. Estuaries and salt marshes are just like wetlands. They are critically important habitat, and they're critically threatened because humans like to live in the same areas. Like beach resorts and places like that were once estuaries or wetlands or salt marshes, right? These are some of the most biodiverse places on planet Earth, and I'm talking more biodiverse in some cases than rainforests. Because of all the nutrients there and because of the interaction between salt and fresh water, you have lots of nutrients, lots of sunlight, very high net primary productivity. Anywhere you have fresh and salt water meeting, you get brackish water, it's called. Right? So it's not quite salt water, it's not fresh water, it's brackish water. And these kinds of habitats form important nurseries for young fish and crustaceans and other organisms. So these are important for not just fishing industry, but they could be important for numerous other things as well. Now, another type of salt marsh estuary habitat is called the mangrove forest. And the mangrove forest is dominated by the mangrove tree, which are these trees right here. They are specially designed with roots that help them stay up above most of the water. They're kind of like stilts, but they've evolved to live in almost completely salt water and fresh air, depending on the tidal shift. Again, a critical habitat. It's important for protecting inland areas from storm surge and hurricanes and tidal waves and things of that nature. And it is an important habitat and nursery for many young fish and crustacean species. And this is also a biome that has seen some significant threats from human encroachment. Now, like I said, we will be revisiting the intertidal zone. Intertidal zone, again, is the band between the high tide and the low tide line. Right? That's intertidal. It can be sandy or it can be rocky, steep, or shallow sloped. It depends. Here in the Northeast, we tend to have, or at least in the lower Northeast, like near New York and Connecticut and New Jersey, you tend to have shallow, gradual gradient beaches. It's sandy in nature. The further north you go on the East Coast, in Maine, you have steep, rocky outcrops and very, very little sand. Anything that lives here has to deal with the constant battering of the surf and constant exposure or regular exposure to fresh air. Because if you're not aware, things that live in the ocean don't like to be out of the ocean. It doesn't do well. It's bad for their health. So anything that lives here has to deal with that drying out regularly. It has to deal with being battered by waves regularly. Anything like that. Species that live here have to deal with that. So these guys tend to be a little more tough. Like if you look here, these mussels are literally glued themselves to rocks. Starfish are, if they really don't want you to pick them up, they won't let you pick them up. They can attach themselves to a surface or a food source, and it's all but impossible to tear them off. Same thing with plants that live around here. They're designed to constantly be battered. Now, one of the more popular biomes would be a coral reef. They tend to be in shallower, warm seas, not a lot of nutrients there. So the reef itself is what creates so much biodiversity. Otherwise, there's not a lot of plants going on. There's not a lot of photosynthesis, not a lot of productivity, not a lot of nutrients. Now, the coral itself is a symbiote. Remember, we learned about symbiosis in our first installment. It's a relationship between an animal that's related to a jellyfish and an algae, a zooxanthellae algae. So, a coral is made up of thousands of little polyps, which is basically like a self-contained animal of itself. It has a mouth, it has tentacles, they can reproduce, and they're responsible for eating. The zooxanthellae are algae that live in their tissues. So during the day, when there's plenty of sunlight, the zooxanthellae do their photosynthesis thing, and they share some of the resources that they produce with the coral itself. So the coral lives off of that during the day. At night, when the algae go dormant, then the animal portion of the coral wakes up and the tentacles emerge from the polyps and they grab any kind of drifting debris or organisms and consume it that way. So the algae gets shelter and gets some nutrients from the coral, and the coral gets energy from the algae. It's a symbiotic relationship. It's a very delicate symbiotic relationship, which we'll be looking at later in the series. Remember, coral reefs, again, are one of those really high biodiversity places. Lots of productivity because of the algae living in the coral, and a lot of biodiversity, a lot of places and habitats for animals to live, from fish to crustaceans to snails and slugs and octopi. You name it, it's usually, if not lives there now, it will spend part of its life there. Okay, so let's recap aquatic biomes. Major factors we got to keep in mind, as opposed to terrestrial. We need to keep in mind light, water depth, water temperature, dissolved oxygen content, and nutrient availability. These are some of the important characteristics that these biomes will have in common. Lakes and ponds come in two different types, and they can be divided into 4 different zones. Streams and rivers can be divided into 3 different zones, depending on where you are in the course of the river. The ocean environment is divided itself into 5 different zones, and there are biomes that you can find in each one of those. There are dozens of marine biomes. We covered some of the main ones here, as well as the zonation of the ocean. And one of the most important things I want you to walk away with is the idea that estuaries are some of the most productive and biodiverse places on the planet, and they're also some of the most threatened locations on the planet. So keep that in mind anytime near you that you're seeing development in these kinds of estuaries. Here along the Hudson, the entire course of the Hudson right here is part of an estuary. So any development along the Hudson River is a threat to the ecosystem that we have up and down the sides. So that wraps up this installment. Thank you for joining me today, and until next time, this is Mr. L signing off. Peace.